I'm joined now by Kaushik Basu, the former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. Thanks very much, Mr. Basu, for being with us. Now, the survey says that recovery is complete. We need to, go beyond the pandemic. Is economic concern linked to the pandemic, in your opinion, well and truly over?
No, the recovery, Vishnu, is not complete, but what is correct, and I have just only glanced through the economic survey, is that right now India is in a relatively good position given the global situation. So if you look at the fiscal numbers, if you look at India's growth the last year, it is all looking reasonable. But we have to keep in mind that growth getting back to where we were does not mean that we've reached pre-pandemic level, because the pandemic was a huge dip and we are climbing up. I mean, one does not want to put all attention on that, but if you take the last 3 years growth and take the average, it is roughly 2.8%. Some people will say 2.85, some will say 2.75, but roughly there. So we still have a distance to go. What is a good point, the strength of India right now, is that in the global situation, it is relatively stable. However, one has to keep in mind that the coming year is expected to be a very, very turbulent year for the world, especially emanating out of the advanced industrialized economies. So India needs not just to get back to previous growth, but build up the strength to take on a turmoil. So this is, if one may use an flying analogy, the time for brace position because of the global situation. And there I feel there is a lot that still needs to be done.
Mr. Basu, are we on the stepping board to, I don't know, profound economic growth, as the economic survey seems to suggest?
That I do not. So I do feel we are at a relatively strong position, as I just said, vis-a-vis the world, but the long-run foundations, I do worry that actually are being weakened rather than strengthened. And I can give actually specific numbers to show that. One of them, the most important, is investment as a share of GDP. The investment rate. And this is true that right from 2002, the investment rate began rising in India, and by 2011 it was at 39%, where India was looking like an East Asian rapid growing economy. From 2011 it began coming down slowly, and now rapidly it's at 32%. The biggest driver of growth has got weakened, and that is what we need to attend to very rapidly. The other indicator, which is very worrying, is unemployment. India's unemployment, especially youth unemployment, is like a troubled Middle Eastern economy. So we are right now at a relatively strong point, and one does appreciate that that's good. But the foundations are being weakened, and I'm not feeling optimistic unless there is determination shown in this budget, specific measures taken to turn things around.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about labor force participation. The fact is that we have relatively low labor force participation. What can be done to incentivize this?
No, and the employment participation being low can be for good reasons if it happens because the opportunities for other things are so excellent. You are studying, you are doing other things, you don't want to be in the labor force. But there is a term that economists use called the discouraged worker effect. When you feel so discouraged by the labor market that you don't even show up as looking for work. And with India's youth unemployment at roughly 28%, which is shockingly high, double many of East Asian countries, which are around 14%, I believe there is a lot of discouraged worker effect also there. So unemployment should be treated on a war footing, and I'm waiting to see whether there will be measures announced tomorrow to begin to turn things around. This is not something that can be turned around in 1 year, 2 years, but we have to do the foundation work for the next 5 years, 6 years, 10 years.
You know, foreign portfolio equity flows January to December are down to 20 billion. And now a lot of people would say that that has to do with the global sort of situation. People park their money in various economies depending on how much equity, how much they can actually play with. Is that the larger issue here, or is there some sort of sense of uncertainty with the Indian economy and the equity markets?
Yes, correct assessment. But Vishnu, over here again, the responsibility is a little bit ours, little bit also the global context. The situation on the whole, there is so much uncertainty in the world that capital is not sloshing about looking for the best place for investment. And we do know that in troubled times, even if the trouble begins in the United States, capital tends to stay there as a relative safe haven. Where there is hope for India, but once again, it needs far-reaching policy reforms, and I haven't seen enough of that, is as the Chinese economy, the confidence in the Chinese economy goes down, there is going to be capital in search of where to park in developing countries. And that's where, and India right now, India is a potential place, but once again, unless we can put our foundations on a stronger footing, and too many of these are just headlines, not really stronger footing that we are doing, this capital is not going to come here. There are smaller countries, Vietnam, Bangladesh, even in Latin American countries, which will begin to attract this capital, which is going out of China.
Sure.
So once again, a lot to be done. And once again, all eyes are on the budget, not because this is something that, in all fairness, that Nirmala Sitharaman can do at one go, but we are waiting to see that whether this is going to be the turning around point, because on fundamentals, we are weakening our economy. The investment rate is the biggest indicator of that.
You know, you mentioned China in your answer. Do you believe that there would be some sort of significant shift in manufacturing from China to India?
There is the potential, and we have to work towards it. But Vishnu, this goes outside just plain simple economics. Investment comes in an ethos of trust. So the political institutions, the social institutions need to be strong. John Maynard Keynes talked about recognizing that investment is not just a matter of fiscal policy or monetary policy. He used to talk of animal spirits.
Yeah.
So there is a mystical element there, frankly. So it is not something that the finance minister can come and say that I'm going to draft a plan to correct it. But the ethos of trust needs to be built up if we want that investment. And from the first data coming in, the Chinese investment, that little bit is moving out. India is getting some of that, but not the disproportionate amount that we were hoping would be coming into India.
You know, one of the sectors, and I follow this somewhat more closely than I follow the rest of the budget, which has been suffering forever, is the defense budget. As a percentage of GDP, it's at what? Its lowest since the 1962 war. Considering the threats that we have, and considering that our defense budget is essentially messed up because of very high expenses in salary payouts and pension payouts, is this not an area where more needs to go into capital expenditure?
Yeah, Vishnu, that would be my hunch. I have not looked at the defense budget in any great detail, but there are some supporting investments which, though not directly into defense, shows up the country's strength. And on that, there has been some improvement, which is CapEx, generally capital expenditure by the government. So that sort of shows up, creates space for greater military spending. But frankly, I don't know the details of the military spending to be able to comment on that. On CapEx also, I should point out that while government capital expenditure is going up, that is not translating yet into private investment. And once again, that problem is knowing. One more thing, I don't know if you're not asking me that, but I will point out, inequality from all dimensions is going up. And there is actually now study after study happening within India using Government of India data, that there's much greater scope for taxing the top end of the income range in India. There is a wonderful working paper at the Delhi School of Economics by Professor Ram Singh, which documents in detail that the tax paid at the top end, there are in terms of pure rates on paper, it looks very high. But if you look at the actual tax paid, it's very low. If this can be tapped, that money can be used, whether it be military, whether it be investment, there's a lot of productive expenditure. One more fiscal point I should make out of the revenue coming into the center. A disproportionate amount is interest payment. In fact, for the center's budget, 43% of the revenue is going to go on interest payment where there's no flexibility. So for productive expenditure, we have to raise revenue, and India's tax to GDP ratio of roughly 12.5% is way less than many other countries. We need to tax intelligently and divert that money to productive areas.
You know, Mr. Basu, we are a services, and this is a broader question, we are a services sector-oriented economy, but if you look at many of the Asian tigers, when they were growing at their peak, they were manufacturing-oriented. How do you contrast the two, and what does it say about us?
This is a big puzzle. I mean, India stands out globally as when the agricultural sector began gradually shrinking, as happens in all developing emerging economies. In most places, the manufacturing grows in leaps and bounds. India jumped over that in a very strange way, and this is the story of the last 30 years, 20 years. The services sector, India was a global story. I do believe that though the services sector has played a very major role for India, India is where India is today because of the rise of the services sector right from 1992, 1993. But to absorb the labor, you need the manufacturing sector. And this needs dissection. We have to move away from good banner headlines that we are too obsessed with and bring in minds to see that why are we not growing in the manufacturing sector? We have labor. We've got resources of all kinds. It's the flaw in policy that we are not doing, and it's not today's flaw. So you don't have to feel politically guilty in pointing out that there is a flaw. It's a long-run flaw that we need to correct. We have to move away from banner headlines to dissection of the data and numbers. And believe me, the Indian bureaucracy has talent enough to do that.
All right, well, let's see how that talent actually works. Tomorrow's the big day as far as the budget is concerned. Millions across the country will be watching out for that.